Hi, and welcome to the first lecture after the midterm. And so this is the introduction to syntax, and this is going to be your first lecture in syntax. You have two new readings. This is chapter 5 and chapter 6 of your textbook. Chapter 5 is a little bit more basic than chapter 6. So if you have been struggling with parts of speech, of identification of parts of speech, when you were doing your morphology section, Chapter 5 is going to clear a lot of clarification questions you may have had with parts of speech and identifying parts of speech and things like that. So I highly recommend reading that and then moving on to Chapter 6 of syntax. So just as a reminder about the question that we have been interested in this entire semester, we have been asking the question, what are the rules and representations that underlie our ability to speak and understand a language? And we've kind of answered it post-midterm with mental representations such as phonetics and IPA, with phonology such as syllabification, and with morphology such as the right-hand head rule, etc. And now we are going to move on to a little bit more complicated and complex process that happens with language, and this is syntax. And so I've defined syntax for you. It's a study of the rules of sentence formation. So syntax tells you how you can combine different words into sentences, such as the dog chased the cat. And as you can see, dog, the cat chased the is not a grammatical sentence of English, and that's why I have the star in front of dog, which means that this sentence is not grammatical. And syntax also tells you how the different combinations can actually give you meaning. So the dog chased the cat has a different meaning from the cat chased the dog. We will get more into number 2 when we get into the next module, which is semantics, but very often syntax and semantics go hand in hand with each other. And so when we talk about sentences and when we talk about how to combine words into sentences, we are talking about categories of words. So here's an illustration for you. It's a very simple sentence. Dave danced. Now, when you take Dave danced, the rule that forms this sentence is not that take Dave, take dance, and put them together to form a sentence, but it's a much more general kind of rule. And the rule is more like take a noun, any noun of English, take any verb of English, combine the noun and the verb together, and what you get is a sentence. So as you can see, syntax has to do with parts of speech and more generalized categories of words such as nouns and verbs and adjectives and so on and so forth. So obviously, if we had a rule that was as specific as take Dave and take dance and put them together to form a sentence, you would have millions and millions of rules of English because you have millions of nouns and millions of verbs. And so it would not be easy for the child who's learning language to actually learn all these different rules of syntax. And that's why we talk about the generality of syntactic rules. And to play my favorite illustration game, I'm going to make you give you a new word that I made up, and the word that I have made up is snurred, and it means a game that can be won in under 10 hours. And you know that this game is a real snurd. Don't buy that snurd. Snurds really annoy me, are all good sentences. But I snurd every weekend, I play every weekend, I play every snurd, etc. are bad sentences. And this is because of the category of snurd. This game is a real snurd is a good sentence because the category of snurd is a noun, and therefore that is a good sentence. Whereas I snurd every weekend, snurd is being used as a verb, but the category of snurd is not that of a verb. And so you as a speaker or a child who's learning a language will know as soon as you make up a new word what the category of that word is based on the syntactic positions that this word can appear in different sentences. So when you learn snurd, or when I told you that snurd is a game that can be won in under 10 hours, you knew that that was a noun. And therefore, you knew what are the syntactic positions in which you can actually put this particular word to get grammatical sentences of English. So here are syntactic categories. We saw a couple of these syntactic categories in the morphology section, and I told you that I will come back to this in detail in syntax. And so a syntactic category is also called as a lexical category or a part of speech. And these are the word categories that the rules of syntax make reference to. So here are some nouns, and we are going to refer to nouns as N and verbs as we have been doing in the morphology section. So I've given you a couple of different nouns, a couple of different verbs, and I've also given you the characteristics of nouns and verbs. And this is how I want you to understand a noun and a verb. A noun is something where you can have a determiner such as a, and, the, etc. in front of it, right? So any noun can have a, and the in front of it. A verb can have an auxiliary verb or helping verb like will in front of it. And then we have adjectives that can actually come in between the determiner, a and the, and a noun, such as the happy dog, the doable idea, etc. Right? So these are the three main syntactic categories. Now, very often my students say that, well, in 5th grade or 6th grade, somebody told you that a noun, verb, and adjective is a person, place, or thing, an action, and a quality. And I'm going to tell you that these definitions are wrong. And I don't want you going out there into the school district and teaching your students that a noun, verb, and an adjective is a person, place, or thing, and an action, or a quality, because that's not correct. What is correct is that, well, the characteristics of these kind of syntactic categories have to do with the kind of position in a sentence that they can appear in. So a noun can appear with a determiner, a verb can appear with a helping verb, and an adjective appears in between a determiner and a noun. So these are syntactic positions. You can test them versus something like a verb as an action is not true, because you have different verbs like love and know that don't describe actions. Actually, love is a state of being. Knowing something is also a state of being. It's not an action verb. And not all adjectives describe qualities. And to say something is a thing doesn't mean anything, because anything can be a thing. So those definitions, throw those out of the window for the purposes of 315. They're not going to help you. They're also not going to help you if you're trying to teach English in secondary ed. I want you to teach or learn noun, verb, and adjective with these syntactic categories and syntactic definitions of them. A noun can appear after a determiner such as a, and, or the. A verb can come with another helping verb or an auxiliary verb such as will, and an adjective can come between the determiner and the noun. Here are some more syntactic categories. Determiner, we're going to use D for determiners, and determiners are things like the, a, and, some, every, no, must, etc. And don't worry about the characteristic of determiner. We're not going to be worried about that for 315. And prepositions are the next syntactic category. These are things like to, for, with, over, under, etc. And also don't worry about the main characteristic of preposition. We're going to use P for preposition. What we're going to do now is I'm going to teach you something called the phrase structure rules of syntax. And so to do this, what we are going to be using are nouns, verbs, adjectives, determiners, and prepositions, right? So N, we, A, D, and P, and we are going to see some of the different rules of English. So the first simple observation that we can make is that we can take a noun, we can take a verb, and you can form a very simple sentence of English. Dogs run, boys dance, girls laugh. These kind of sentences are called as intransitive sentences of English because they take only one subject and they cannot take an object. So you cannot say dogs run John, boys dance girls, girls laugh boys, right? Those are ungrammatical sentences of English, suggesting that these verbs can only take a subject and no object. So these are intransitive verbs of English. And we can write this in basic phrase structure notation as S being a sentence, goes to with the arrow, N and we. Now, they look a lot like the morphology rules that we have been seeing in the last module, except that unlike the morphology rules, we don't have a plus sign in between the noun and the verb, right? Because you're not combining phrases together. You're not combining morphemes together. You're combining two individual words together. Noun is a separate word and the verb is a different word. And therefore, that's really the main difference between morphology rules and syntactic rules. So you can create a sentence by taking a noun and taking a verb. And now you can, just like how we draw morphology trees, you can also draw syntactic trees. And these are syntactic trees for very basic noun and verb combinations. You can say dogs run, boys dance, girls laugh. And you can identify the category of each of these words, and you can also identify the top node that this binary branching tree can create, and this is called a sentence or an S. Now, how do we know that there are certain words in sentences that can actually go together? This is what we mean by constituency in syntax. That is, in a sentence, there are certain words that can go together. And therefore, I've given you a constituency hierarchy. When you talk about a sentence, you can talk about different clauses within sentence, and you might have heard the term main clause versus subordinate clause if you've taken like English 101 or 102. And so the main clause is when you have the main verb of the sentence with the subject, and the subordinate clause is when you have an embedding of a different verb and a different subject within a sentence. We're going to be talking about embeddings and clauses a little later on in this module, so don't worry about that for right now. But you know phrases are things like the happy boy, the tall girl, etc., where you have a series of words that can be combined together and they appear together. Those are phrases. And then phrases are combined of words. Phrases are formed from words. So these are constituents. They are syntactic units that work together. And so it's very important when we talk about syntactic constituency to talk about constituency tests. So I've given you two tests over here. The first one is a substitution test, where you can take a particular word in a sentence and substitute it with a pronoun. So in this case, I have substituted the noun, the cat, with the pronoun it. So the dog chased it. What does it refer to in the sentence? It refers to the cat. That's a substitution test. You can also say it chased it to mean the dog chased the cat, right? So you can combine, you can substitute different pronouns for different things in the sentence. So in this case, the dog is the subject, the cat is the object, and therefore you can have two different pronouns substituting two different nouns within the sentence. You can also do a standalone test. So you can ask questions and constituents can form the answers to these questions. So you can say, what did the dog chase? And you can say the cat, right? So the correct answer to the standalone test for constituency is the entire phrase, right? The cat, not just cat. And that's what constituency tests actually show, that the determiner, like a, an, and the noun actually combine together and they go together as one syntactic unit within a sentence. Now let's move on to forming bigger structures with smaller structures within sentences. And so we said earlier that you can create sentences by combining nouns and verbs together in English. Yet there are bigger sentences in English, right? So I've given you sentences, dogs chase cats, some dogs chase the cats, old dogs chase young cats, some old dogs chase the young cats, etc. And you can see that these are not intransitive verbs. They are verbs that actually take an object, and therefore these are transitive sentences of English. Transitive meaning the verb can take a subject and an object. And therefore you can see that we need more than just the rule. Sentence can be formed with a noun and a verb to create all these different sentences. But now what we can see is that these rules that we have put on the right-hand side of the table are getting very lengthy and they are getting very tedious for us to remember. And we are also missing a pattern. So that's the pattern that we are going to try to capture. The pattern that we're going to try to capture is that whenever you have a noun, the sentence also allows a determiner with a noun, an adjective and a noun, and a determiner, adjective, noun. So just a noun is, as in the first sentence, you just have cats, right, in the object position. But you can also have the cats, right, or some dogs, where you have a determiner and a noun combining together. And then you have an adjective and a noun. So old dogs, young cats, etc., is a combination of an adjective and a noun. And then you have determiner, adjective, and nouns like some, old, dogs, etc. What we are going to do is we are going to collapse the noun, the determiner noun, the adjective noun, the determiner adjective noun, and call this the noun phrase. Okay, the noun phrase, and we are going to abbreviate this as the NP. So we've been talking about nouns as N, but now we are going to be talking about the constituency of the noun, which is the noun phrase or the NP. And now we can write different rules for the patterns that we wanted to capture in the previous slide. You can say that you can create a noun phrase with just a noun in it. You can create a noun phrase with both a determiner and a noun. You can create a noun phrase with an adjective and a noun, and you can create a noun phrase with a determiner, an adjective, and a noun. And therefore now what we can do is we can have not just a sentence that's combined with a noun phrase and a verb, but you can also have a sentence where you have a noun phrase, a verb, and another noun phrase. So S goes to NPV captures intransitive sentences of English with just one subject, and S goes to NPV and NP captures transitive sentences of English. So here is a summary of what we just saw with phrase structures for both noun phrases and sentences. For noun phrases, we have 4 different rules where you have a noun phrase can either be just a noun, right, cat or cats. NP can be a determiner and an N, the cats. NP can be an adjective and an N, old cats, or it can be a determiner, an adjective, and an N, the old cats. And the phrase structure rules for sentences are 2, S goes to NPV, and S goes to NPV and NP. And now what you can see is you can start to draw tree structures with these kind of trees. So you can have S goes to NPV. You start from the top and go down to the bottom, right? You don't start at the bottom and build your tree up. You always go top down with syntax. So you start with S goes to NPV, and then you can break down NP into determiner and N. So ideally, where you have to start with for these kind of cases is a label bracketing, right? A label bracketing is where you have, you take the sentence, some dogs run, and you identify individually each of the words with their categories, with their lexical categories. So some is a determiner, dogs is nouns, and run is we, right? So that's the, N, and we. And then you identify the phrases or the constituencies within these sentences. So you know that some dogs can combine together and form a noun phrase. So we combine that together and write NP, and then the we is separate, right? So S goes to NPV, NP goes down to a D and N. So to do this, you need to have 2 kinds of knowledge. One is identifying different word categories, because if you don't know how to identify word categories, you're not going to be able to draw tree structures. So that's why I recommend reading chapter 5 before you get into this lecture, or pause, read chapter 5, and then come back to this video, because that's really, really important for you, I think. And I've seen across the years that I've been teaching 315 that the biggest struggle with students is identifying the correct parts of speech, right? And this is because you did not get grammar lessons in secondary school, in middle school, etc. So you're lacking that information as you come into college. And so it's good for you to review that. It's good for you to have that kind of knowledge before you move on with finishing up this lecture. And the second kind of knowledge that you need is to identify these constituents, right? So to know that a determiner can go with a noun and that can create a noun phrase, etc. So that's the 2 kinds of knowledge that you will need to draw tree structures like this. Here are bigger tree structures. So this is the young cats chase old dogs. S goes to NP, we, and NP with a transitive sentence of English. And what I would highly recommend you to do is, once you finish watching the lecture, once you have an intuitive understanding of the different sentences that we have been talking about, the different kinds of rules that we have been talking about, draw this tree structure without looking at this tree on the slide, right? So write down the young cats chase old dogs. Individually identify the word categories and the phrases, right? The two noun phrases within the sentence, and then draw the syntactic tree top down, right? So think of this as an exercise or a practice in doing syntax. Your assignment for syntax also has to do with drawing trees, so you will be getting a lot of practice. But as you can see, it's easy when you see it as on the slide, but when you start to do it, you will see that you may run into problems. So I always recommend the more practice you get, the better prepared you're going to be with answering a syntax question, either in your assignment or in your final exam. And here is the tree structure for dogs chase most cats, and I also want you to do this at home. So do some dogs run, the young cats chase old dogs, and dogs chase most cats at home. So here are our phrase structure rules for both noun phrases and sentences. But what we are going to do is we are going to try to condense our rule for noun phrases, because we don't want to have 4 different rules for noun phrases. We like to have one rule or as little rules as possible, because that's going to make our life simpler. I'm going to introduce to you what we call the parenthesis notation, right? So the parenthesis notation is basically an optionality that you can actually see within the sentence. So let's take the rule NP goes to D, A, and N. And as you can see, the only thing that's required to make an NP is a noun, right? And that's the only thing that is not an option. Everything else within the sentence is an option. So you can have an optional determiner, you can have an optional adjective, but you always need to have an obligatory noun. And so therefore, by introducing the parenthetical notation, what we can do is we can put D and A in parentheses, and therefore you get the rule NP goes to an optional D, an optional A, and an obligatory N. And I've told you what this rule says. This rule says that an NP has to have an N in it, that's obligatory. An NP can but need not also contain a D or an A. If there is a D, it has to precede the N and an A, and if there is an A, it has to precede the N and follow any D, right? So here is the new phrase structure rules condensed for noun phrases. Now we don't need all the 4 rules that we had before for noun phrases. What we need is only this one particular rule that we have with the parentheses notation. NP goes to an optional D, an optional A, and N, and then we have the 2 phrase structure rules for sentences. Now, how do we know that we can actually create these kind of rules, right, from these 3 sentences, sentence phrase structure rules that we have? Well, what we can do is we have to access the mental lexicon that we talked about in the beginning of the morphology module. We access the mental lexicon. The mental lexicon is going to tell you the syntactic category, how the word is pronounced, etc. And so what we do is we take a look at the mental lexicon. This is exactly what I gave you from the morphology section. Here's an example of a dog, which is a noun, and jump, which is a verb. And the key idea is that we create these kind of skeletons or syntactic skeleton structures, then we access the mental lexicon and we insert in the particular words. So the first step or the procedure for making sentences is to identify the different rules that you would need to make the sentence. Create a skeleton, right? S goes to NP, we, and then NP goes down to an A and an N. As you can see, this is a hierarchical structure, not a linear structure. So you have to make sure that you keep that in mind while you're doing tree structures to syntax. And then you go to the mental lexicon. You identify the words that could be an N and could be a we and an A, and then you insert that in. That's the third step. So old dogs jump. So identify the lexical categories of the words, identify the rules that you would need, create a skeleton of the tree structure, and then insert in the words. So this is the three-step procedure for making sentences in syntax. Right, so I've summarized for you the three steps. First, you make the syntactic tree or the syntactic skeleton. Then you look for lexical categories that match the tree structure, and then you insert them into the tree under the right category labels. So what I want you to do between now and the next lecture is to practice the three sentences that we have, because we are going to introduce more complexity in the next video. So do read your chapter 5 and chapter 6 and practice the three sentences or syntactic trees before we move on to the next video.